Hi, I'm Marcel, and I'm one of the creators of the Ornatrix hair grooming software, which at the moment is available as plugins for 3ds Max, Maya, Cinema 4D, and Unreal Engine. But we are also in the process of writing a standalone application. You can apply for the application beta right now on our website. If you just go to the Ornatrix app page, we have here the beta request access button. And we'll get back to you shortly so you can start using the application that's shown in this video. So I just want to create a little of a longer format video without any AI voice or whatever to show you the new features that come with the Ornatrix application, as well as to familiarize with the user interface and create a groom that could be useful in production in a way that we preserve all the procedurality of this groom. So to start, it's always a good idea to have reference. I went to Google Images and I found like a reference of some long hair, and I picked a single one here. I think this one is kind of basic enough to fit within this video, but at the same time has some realistic, interesting details. I can show you one of my favorite ways to create this type of hairstyle. So here it is blown up, and I will set it aside and use as reference. As with all the things when you model, it's good to have something that you can reference so you can stay grounded in the reality and not stray off too much like the real world. So first I will get the character bust mesh into my scene. For this I can use the file import option. Here you can select your mesh. It can be either an Alembic file or a USD file, so you can import the mesh from your favorite application. I already did it before, so I'm going to go to recent files, and here we have this ABC Alembic file, which has two meshes inside. We're not going to use the scalp. We're going to create our own, so we don't need this part. I'm just going to press import, and if I zoom out, here we have our character mesh. There are different shading modes in Ornatrix app. So you can use the F3 button to switch to smooth shading. You can use F4 to show wireframe, F1 to show realistic, and then at any point press F5 to toggle the wireframe mode. You can also press the G button to show or hide the grid, and I prefer to hide it at this point. Next, I will select this Graft Groom tool at the top here. I will select Scalp and Empty, and this way we can take a scalp mesh that is pre-existing in Ornatrix and fit it on top of the character. There are other ways of specifying where to grow the hair, like painting maps, but we already have this tutorial. So for this one, we're going to use something called Graft Grooms in Ornatrix, where you can create these types of groom assets, which are true assets. They can be reused and they can be imported into other hosts where we have a plugin, and they preserve completely all of the information about the operators, the data, so they remain completely procedural and node-based. So I'm gonna select my mesh first of all, and then I need to click at the top of the forehead of the character, and I'm gonna drag to kind of place this on top of my character mesh. If I look a little bit at the sides, you can see that the ears are not perfectly placed. You can select the handles at any time and reposition them, and you can also select the individual vertices. So in this case we have a group of vertices around the ears, and position them around your character mesh. So to me this seems okay, and we can continue working with this scalp on top of our character. So next thing I will do is I will add the guides from mesh operator. In this case, it generated a bunch of guides for me, and guides are blue color by default. If I go here, I can you have all the familiar settings from Ornatrix, so you can change the distribution, the number of roots. I prefer to have the roots like enough roots so that we can define like the detail, overall shape detail within the hair, but at the same time not so many roots that it becomes completely unmanageable and difficult to select, right? So there is always like a sweet spot, and it depends upon the character hairstyle. So something like this seems fine. I'm going to also decrease the length a little bit. And the next operator that I will add is gravity. So the gravity operator will make our hair it's gonna pull it down, it's gonna make it fall. And here I have the default option, so it's gonna be like this by default. One of the things I don't like right now is that we don't have enough segments, enough detail along the length of the strand. So I'm gonna go back to guides from mesh. And as you see, we also have like a preview of the final output hair here, which is nice. And I'm going to change the point count from 10 to 50. So as I do that, you can see that the hair has become smoother. I go back to gravity. It's kind of okay, but one of the issues is that this is not really how the hair behaves, right? So we have like hair at the top here that just goes straight through the mesh and goes down, whereas in real life, usually hair cascades down. So the lower parts of the hair, they go closer to the character, and the top parts at the top of the hair of the character are the outer layers. So we can kind of simulate this in Ornatrix by using this cascade option here. It's disabled by default, but I can enable it and play around with these parameters to make sure that that the hair goes down, but at the same time it has enough of a like overall shape definition to match what we're trying to achieve. You don't have to get this right immediately. We can always go back and adjust these values later on. So the hair became shorter because it started to go around, and now we can go back to guides from mesh and increase the length a little bit more. Again, if I look at my reference, the hair kind of flows down much lower on this character. It's like way below even the armpit level. So our character bust here is too short, and this will become evident. Just gonna select back my hair. So this will become evident if I add a push away from surface modifier or operator. And actually right now there is a problem, is that it's using the scalp or the mesh that grew the guides as the collision mesh. And what we really want to use is the actual character mesh that we imported. So to fix this, I can go back to node graph. In the guides from mesh operator, there is a character mesh slot. When it's disconnected, the distribution mesh, which is our graphed surface, is going to be used as a collision surface. But if you connect this character mesh explicitly to the input to the imported mesh, you can see that now it starts to, we have our guides that are colliding with this input mesh. One problem at the moment is that the mesh is an open mesh, so it doesn't really have a face to close it here, and we can and at the edges there are always artifacts with collisions. So what we can do is go back to the baked mesh operator here and add an extrude mesh operator on top of it. Once I do that, you can see that we now can add like extra length at the open edges of the mesh. And the only problem remaining is that there are two open edges. There was one at the bottom, but there is also one here at the mouth, like on the other side of the mouth, and we can see it here. So what we can do is we can specify the boundary indices for which we want to create these extruded faces. In this case, we just want 0, right? Or I can select the other one by using 1. So I'll press 0, and now the hair predictably falls on top of our mesh. If I go back to the push away from surface operator, I can play around with the details. For example, I can make it push away a little bit further, and I can smooth the hair such that it's a little bit more flowy and not like the pushing doesn't happen as abrupt, which I think it's a little bit more realistic. So I want to do a couple of things to kind of match this shape. There are 3 things that I notice. The first one is that this hair is kind of separated into 3 different layers. The first layer are those long hairs that flow all the way down. The second layer are these medium hairs right here. You see how they're like shorter than the other ones. And the third one, that was the second one. And the third layer is the banks here. They're the shortest of all, and they're also kind of separated down the middle. So first, what I want to do is I want to use our edit guides operator to define or refine the shape a little bit to define to closer match the reference. First is I'm going to go to gravity and adjust a little bit more. This seems to be closer to our reference. Second, I'm going to select the hairs after gravity, right? So we already want them to be down here, but before the push away from surface operator, I'm just going to press this button, by the way, which is show end result, and it's going to only show the output of the current operator. So as I go back and forth in the stack, we can see how what kind of effect it does. It has. Actually, let me keep it on. Let me keep it on and turn on the wireframe view so we can see the true length over strands. And now is where I want to separate the hair into 3 layers, right? So first is that I want to create the middle layer. I'm going to switch back to realistic mode. And I'm going to use the select brush tool here. By the way, you can use buttons, number pad from 1 to 9 to change between these tools, right? So number 5 selects the tool. In this case, the select brush. And I'm going to drag over the strands that I want to select. And I think this will be my middle layer. So the next one and the next brush I will use is the cut brush. Here I will select the effect selected only option so we don't cut the strands in the background. And I think by the reference it looks like those strands are about the collarbone area. So I'm going to drag and cut it like this here. And then the final layer, actually I think it's a bit longer, maybe here it's better. So, and then the final layer are the banks. So the next I'm going to select the Edit Strands tool, and I'm going to select just these strands in front, which I will elect to become my banks, right, in front of the face. So maybe a little bit more. At the bottom here of the viewport, you always have these useful hints. So they tell you what the shortcuts are. In this case, you see that the Control plus right click adds to the selection. And I can use that to select a few more hairs. And then again, you can use the Shift to remove from selection. So this looks okay for me. Again, I'm going to go back to the cut brush. The effect selected only is on, and around, I think, the nose area is where they finish here, but in reality, they're a bit longer because they're curls. So maybe around the lip area is where I should cut these strands, like here. So we now separated our strands into those 3 different layers. And I think this layer over here still kind of long. I'm not sure what happened, but I think I accidentally undid my cutting. So I'm just going to select the cut brush and I'm going to cut again this area. It was about this long. Okay, so now we have our 3 different layers separated. We have the banks over here, we have the medium hairs and the longer hairs. And I think at this point it's a good idea to actually start to visualize this as dense hairs instead of the guides, just so that we get closer to the final result. So I'm going to add the hair from guides operator. As I added, you can see that there are still issues, but we get finally some dense hair happening. The hair is too thick, so first I'm going to go and add a change width operator to make it a little bit thinner, and I'm going to increase the width a little bit. Before we go any further, I actually wanted to remind that it's a good idea to save, right? So I'm going to press Ctrl S to save the file. I'm just going to leave the, actually, let's change the file name to Wavy hair. Right, it's an OXZ file, which is our proprietary groom format. I'm just gonna, we already have that file actually. I'm not very original today. So I'm going to press yes. It's going to save that file as wavyhair.oxz and we can continue working. One other very useful feature that the Ornatrix app has, again, is the save incremental option, which you can use by pressing Control plus Insert. And this way, you're going to create a new scene each time you save, and it's going to contain like incrementing numbers, which is really useful for if something goes wrong and you want to go back a few versions and recover a previous version of work in progress that you have. So one thing that's kind of annoying me right now is that the hair is the same color as the character mesh. Let's change it. We can select the color box over here. Select the hair color. In shaded mode, it's not really easy to see the final result. So I'm going to switch to realistic mode. Here we have like a standard material applied, but because it's all ray traced and it has global illumination and things like that, it's a little bit easier to see what you will have finally during a render of this. So again, that's not really close to the character, and the color changes along the length, which is something that we'll do in a future tutorial. But in terms of overall color, I think this is acceptable. So next thing is, inside the hair from guides operator, what we want to do is we want to avoid this interpolation between the three layers that we created, right? So we don't want this short layer of the banks going like this here. What we can do to fix this is scroll down, and in this partings section, there is an automatic partings option. I'm going to set it to enabled. We don't want really to part by angle threshold, so I'm going to reduce it, but we do want to part by distance threshold. I'm going to set a low value like 20 or 19 or something like this. And now you see that the hairs are still interpolated. The hairs are still interpolated, but between the layers, they are not, which is exactly what we're looking for. So now the next thing is I want to start defining a little bit more the shape of my strands. We can do this by going back all the way back to the guides here, selecting the ones that we want. So in this case, I'm going to select 1/2 of these guides. I'm going to use the scale tool. And actually, sometimes it's better here to uncheck the preserve length option. So again, preserve length is unchecked. And I'm going to bring them together and maybe rotate them a little bit to much closer what we have in the reference. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, but a little bit opposite. So again, I'm going to scale it down. I'm going to rotate, bring them to the side like this. Maybe actually a little bit more, and bring them back. So here I would do this. This is not good that we're getting so close to the surface of the mesh. So I'm going to go to these problematic places. I'm going to decrease the influence and drag them out of the mesh, these strands. And I can do the same thing for the other ones. At any point, you can click on this show end result button and to preview the final hair. So as I separated these two banks into their own directions, if I go back and look at the output, you see that there is a problem that there is the hair is interpolating between the banks. And we can prevent this by separating the hair into two groups, the left and the right. So I'm going to go back to the edit guides operator. Maybe I'll use the strand selection mode only. Select 1/2 of these strands. Inside the strand groups here in these options, I'm going to use the assign unique button to assign unique group to these strands. I'm going to select the other half and do the same thing. And as you can see, the groups are color coded. So so the right side is different from left side. And if I go back to hair from guides now, again, down in the settings here in the partings option, you can find the use strand groups as parts checkbox, which you can check. And this is going to separate my hairs into two different parts. So after the change width operator, I will add clump operator to create like small clumps on the hair. Actually, before the clump operator, let's add some curls, right? So I'm going to add the curl operator here. And in fact, the change width operator has a problem because it's making the hair width slowly taper down towards the end, which is not really ideal for longer hairs. So I'm going to change it such that it tapers off, but closer to the tips. And then we can also decrease the width a little bit. We can see the final preview. One other important feature here in Ornatrix app is at the top right, you have the render mode, right? So render mode makes the hairs more dense and more detailed. And you can customize this individually in each operator. So if I press this, it's going to give me more hairs previewed inside the viewport. And inside the hair from guides, just like for rendering inside other hosts where Ornatrix is a plugin, you can set the root count And you can also set the previous strand fraction. So this percentage is what is actually shown when you're not in the render mode, which is toggleable using the F10 key, right? And the root count is the final count of the strands or curves that will be exported for render or generated during the rendering phase. So here I can introduce some curling. It takes some time to play around with these parameters to get them right, and we will speed up this part of the video. Again, you don't have to get it completely right here. The beauty of working on a procedural groom like this, where we have a whole node graph of operators, is that you can change any of the previous operators before, and the changes will propagate. For example, we can go all the way back to gravity here and continue playing with the gravity, and it's going to respect the overall shape that we already defined closer to the top of the stack. So after the curl, I'm going to add a clump node. This will predictably create clumps. By default, there are no clumps. You can either choose to select the strands and create them individually, or you can go here and expand this dynamic clumping option, press enabled, and bump up the number of clumps to the desired amount, something that will closer match the reference. To avoid having clumps going across like this, across the hair partings, we're going to go to the region settings here, check this respect hair parts option, and we're going to increase the shape threshold, shape difference threshold to until a point where no clumps are generated in a bad way. So this seems to be acceptable. I'm going to use my select tool to preview the final shape. And again, I can press the F10 button to preview the final hair, right? And in some instances, just because we have 20,000 hairs here, even on my aging laptop, we can still see almost real-time preview, and I can play around with these operators. So for example, let's increase the number of flyaway strands. We're going to increase the amount. We're going to reduce the clump amount for these strands, so they're not clumped at all. And also maybe introduce a little bit of twisting to the strands. And change various other settings like the clumping along the strand. And again, I can go back and forth and adjust all these settings that I did before. So at this point, I'm going to adjust a little bit more the curling because I see that it's not exactly matching the reference as well as it could. And also on top of the clump, let's add a Frizz operator so that we introduce a little bit of randomness because the hairs right now are sticking too much with each other. So here what I can do is I can use the outliers. I'm going to set the default amount to 0, so no frizz for normal hairs. I'm going to set a certain percentage of the strands to be outliers, and we're going to frizz those strands quite a bit. So it's going to add this like layer of messiness. Actually, let's add a little bit of frizz by default as well. The last issue that I want to resolve really with this groom is that the hairs are still penetrating the character mesh at the end. So what I can do is I can add another push away from surface operator here, and it's going to resolve the rest of the collisions. And again, I can change the distance to be a little bit more. But otherwise, you can see how the hair is now kind of following and flowing on top of our character. So again, I didn't get it too close to the reference image, but you can see how it's kind of within the same ballpark. And I think this is enough for this relatively short tutorial. The last thing I wanted to show is how to export this to your favorite application. So the first step is to select this mesh, and you can export it as a baked file, right? So you can use the export option and export as an either Alembic or USD files. And inside these files, you will have the curves exported. So we have the hair ABC. Let's overwrite it here. So the curves of each strand are going to be written to this file. The second way is by exporting this whole procedural groom, right? So you can just save this file and use this wavy hair.exe file, which is a valid groom format for Ornatrix. But if you want to use this groom on top of like a grafted scalp, like we did here, you can go to Graft menu and select Save Graft Groom. And yeah, let's override the wavy hair. Actually, let's do wavy hair underscore graft, like this. And it's going to save it as a graft groom format. So I will just demonstrate re-importing these two different ways that we just saved also inside Ornatrix app, which you can do. First is the Alembic file, so I'm going to go import. I'm going to import this hair.abc file. You can see that the curves which we saved, they're named after the distribution mesh. We didn't rename it. And as I import, you see the final hair is imported inside the viewport. You can continue editing it as a standard hair object in Ornatrix. So the other way is, you're going to select and delete, is first I'm going to create a sphere. And I'm going to use this Graft Groom tool over here. I'm going to select the scalp and empty, just like we did before. I'm going to fit the scalp. Well, we need to select the sphere first. I'm going to click and fit this scalp on top of my sphere. And now you see we have this wavy hair graft groom that we saved before. It's already present inside the list of the scalp graft mesh. So if I click it, after a warning, it's going to import the groom that we have just saved. Because the geometry of the scalp is different from the scalp before, the hair is kind of like fitted to fit to, or it's adjusted or stretched to fit the scalp. But you can imagine how you can do the same on any character. And in fact, if I grab this, you can see that I can adjust the positions, and you see the hair is adapting itself to fit the Graft Groom. So also one thing you can do is the hair automatically applies a multiplier to adjust for the scale of the scene. But you can adjust on top of that, the scale multiplier here to make the hair longer, as well as to scale up all the changes, or to make it shorter, or to scale the changes down. So these are the basics of Ornatrix app inside as a standalone package. Currently, it's only available for Windows. We will have it available for Mac and Linux before launch, and I hope you guys found this useful, and you will leave or send us feedback as well as feature requests. It would be very interesting to hear your opinion on this. Thanks for watching.